Slavery is a bit complex, and its effects are not as simple as they seem. The implications on culture, society, history, and economy go far beyond what we all have learned at school. The plantation system, along with its slave labor, is mostly described as a tool of British colonization marked by social and political inequality. It connects agricultural prosperity to the dominance of affluent aristocrats and the exploitation of slaves through the harrowing tales of captivity, maltreatment, and dehumanization. For example, as a form of punishment, many male slaves could experience amputation or castration. In some extreme cases, the male organ was cut off altogether. The main purpose was to take away any iota of male pride that they had and to assert the white man's dominance. What's even worse was the main targets were young boys at the ages of 9 to 12, and sadly, many boys lost their lives to the horrendous process because it was painful. Welcome back to Binge History. Today, we will be speaking about what was it like to be a slave on a plantation. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more content just like this one and turn on post notifications. With all that done, let's binge history like we binge eat. African slaves were being used by the Spanish and Portuguese since the 16th century, but the Atlantic slave trade of the 18th century, on the other hand, was a new sort of enslavement on a much larger scale than ever before. It was the British who played a significant role in this trade and got the most profitable source of labor when more and more West Indian plantation owners turned to slaves for a living. However, there are some more factors critical to the development of this slave trade, including the significance of West Indian colonies, labor shortage, inability to identify other labor sources, legal situation, racial attitudes, and religious and military considerations. Slavery did much more than just provide a source of cheap labor for the British. It established a network of systemic exploitation that served as the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. This is evident in the historical development of major cities and seaports such as London and Liverpool, as well as the growth of banking and the financial sector and the expansion of vital manufacturing industries. Europeans established huge plantations in the West Indies. Owners replicated the plantation model on neighboring islands as a result of their success. And more planters sought to purchase enslaved Africans in growing numbers. Actually, plantations were an entirely new economic and social institution as they served as both a farm and a factory. Unlike landed estates in Britain, most plantations focused on a single crop, such as sugarcane, cotton, or tobacco, for export production. Small farms were outperformed by these large-scale specialized plantings of at least 80 to 100 hectares. Even many plantations were large corporations, and managers were often hired to direct operations on behalf of absentee owners back in Britain. And to maintain production, plantations required a huge labor force. So, planters out there turned to slave labor. Also, because of this new type of farming that evolved in the European colonies of the New World, an increasing number of slaves were brought across the Atlantic. As Europeans conquered the Americas, vast tracts of fertile tropical land became available. This land was then used for plantations. Here, we'll look into sugar plantation as a great illustration of how the slave trade created a positive feedback loop of wealth and resources. Sugarcane, a crop in high demand, had been discovered by settlers in the tropical portions of America. It was less expensive than other sweeteners and could revamp the boring diet. In Europe, there was a ready market. It got cheaper as more was cultivated, and more people could buy it. Sugar was a delicacy for the wealthy in the 1600s, whereas it was being consumed in tea by a large number of common people by the 1800s. So, the sugar trade showed the potential to be extremely profitable. Sugar cane could be used to make sugar, but the process was a bit exhaustive. 1 ton of sugar required 50 tons of sugar cane. Planting, maintaining, harvesting, and processing sugarcane in tough and unpleasant conditions needed a big labor force. The only way out was to employ African slaves, and it worked. As a result, the African slave trade evolved. The most dramatic surge in sugar production took place on the largest islands, Jamaica, St. Dominique, and Cuba. And by 1775, Jamaica was producing half of Britain's sugar. The majority of slaves lived and worked on the plantations. Most of these plantations had 50 or fewer slaves. However, the larger plantations had hundreds. Toiled in shifts of up to 18 hours a day during harvest season, the life of slaves on the fields was all about working from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week and having food that was even sometimes unfit for an animal to consume. In other words, the diet mostly offered to the slaves was barely adequate to meet the demands of their heavy workload. Maize, rice, peanuts, yams, and dried beans were included in their common diet. They also got to eat some pork once in a blue moon, but the quality of this food, as we told you earlier, was often compromised. Moreover, the slaves, even their children, were strictly prohibited from consuming any dairy products, regarding the myth of blacks being highly lactose intolerant. Aside from planting and harvesting on a daily basis from dawn till dusk, plantations and farms required a variety of other forms of labor. People who were enslaved had to clear new land, dig ditches, cut and lug wood, and repair buildings and tools. They often worked as mechanics, blacksmiths, drivers, carpenters, and other specialized jobs. Black women had the added burden of caring for their families by cooking and caring for the children, as well as spinning, weaving, and sewing to clothe their families, as they were often not provided with adequate clothing by their owners. Slaves spent their limited leisure time visiting friends and family nearby, sharing stories, and playing music when they could. The banjo, made from a hollow gourd, and the drum were two instruments invented and employed by slaves to create music. Moreover, these slaves tried to stick to their religious beliefs for internal peace and inspiration. Some followed African religions, such as tribal shamanism and Islam. However, Islam was banned later since the Europeans feared that enslaved Africans would be more susceptible to revolt if they were Muslim. As for Christianity, although at first Anglican Christian missionaries often found themselves butting up against uncooperative masters and resistant slaves, many slaves later converted to Christianity and blended Christian influences with traditional African rites and beliefs. Though slavery was a hard and often cruel life, their religious beliefs reminded them that their lives had some meaning as well as dignity and helped them resist the degradation of bondage. Though slavery took several forms, the underlying concepts remained consistent. Slaves were treated as property, and they were treated as such. Their property status was always reinforced through actual or threatened violence alongside the black and white discrimination. Their women were mostly subjected to the threat and practice of sexual exploitation, and there were no safeguards in place to protect them from being sexually stalked, harassed, or raped by masters and overseers, or from being utilized as long-term concubines. The abuse was prevalent, as men in positions of authority took advantage of their predicament. Even if a lady appeared to be okay with the situation, she had no choice. Slave men, on the other hand, were frequently powerless to protect the women they loved. Enslavers or overseers left sexually exploited women assaulted and sometimes pregnant. Even the abused used to continue with enslavers' demands that they reproduce to ensure a future generation of forced bonded labor at plantations. White masters had complete control over a slave's life, and they often treated them as property. Plantation owners were allowed to act as dictators since slaves had no rights, and those who disobeyed or objected, even in minor ways, were punished severely or auctioned. To tell you the truth, until 1723, killing a slave was not even considered a felony in Antigua, and there was little interest in prosecuting for the mistreatment of these slaves, as it was a common practice. Whipping, shackling, hanging, burning, mutilation, branding, rape, and incarceration were all used to punish slaves, but the severity of the punishments meted out to the slaves varied. Even pregnant women were not spared. Runaways who got apprehended may be hung or maimed. They were often whipped for any wrongdoing, and the number of lashes they received varied according to the gravity of their crime. A slave could also be fitted with a metal collar. Such collars were thick and heavy, with projecting spikes that hampered both work and repose. And you will be shocked to know that sometimes the disobedient slaves were also boiled in hot sugar syrup to death. Olaudah Equiano was a formerly enslaved person who published his own life story in 1789. He reported, "I have seen a Negro beaten till some of his bones were broken for even letting a pot boil over. Furthermore, slaves were punished almost as much for symbolic social order transgressions as they were for physical failures. We hope you liked this video. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel without any delays. Make sure you turn on the post notifications and also let us know in the comments section about your views on slaves on the plantation. Thank you for watching Binge History. Until the next time we meet, continue learning and stay healthy.